Let's bring in Mouin Rabbani. He's a non-resident fellow at the Centre of Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and a co-editor of Jadaliyya, an online magazine. Joins us now live from Montreal. Good to have you with us on the programme. Do you think those appeals from the UN or even the US State Department are going to be heard by Tel Aviv, or will they just fall on deaf ears?
I think they'll fall on deaf ears, as they've fallen on deaf ears for over half a century. The State Department spokesman expresses concern about these issues. Imagine if the Palestinian Authority was arming Hamas and Islamic Jihad. I suspect we'd hear a lot more than just verbal concern from the State Department. The problem here is that this extremist settler violence is not the problem itself. It's a symptom of a much larger problem, which is Israel's governmental policy of territorial expansionism in the West Bank since 1967. These settlers are armed by the Israeli state. They operate under the auspices and with the protection of the Israeli military. So to address settler violence independently of Israeli state and government policy doesn't really make much sense. It's the equivalent of addressing the symptoms while doing nothing about the cause.
We often hear that the only way that Palestinians in the occupied West Bank can defend themselves is by throwing stones. So our viewers to this channel may wonder, where are the Palestinian Authority, those that are supposed to protect the Palestinians? If you could just clarify what their role is in the occupied West Bank.
Yes, it's a very good question. And the answer to it is that the role of the Palestinian Authority security forces is not to defend Palestinians from attacks by Israelis, but rather to protect Israel and its occupation from resistance by its own people. The Palestinian Authority security forces are prohibited from operating in those areas outside the main cities where most of the settler violence take place. And they've also taken a political decision to actively cooperate with Israel's army of occupation in order to prevent Palestinian resistance to exactly these kinds of instances of settler violence that we're discussing now. So the Palestinian Authority is simply not a factor in this equation, except that it can be seen as yet another auxiliary of Israel's expansionist policy in the occupied West Bank.
So in terms of the relationship between Palestinian civilians and their own authority, who they would look to protect them, and they know that they can't, what are the options then? Because when Palestinians do fight back, the Israeli response is very heavy-handed.
Well, yes, and just to clarify that Palestinians in these villages that are, again, located outside the main towns and cities where the Palestinian Authority security forces operate, they don't look to the Palestinian Authority for protection. They know they're not going to get any from the Palestinian Authority. So what they do is they defend themselves as best they can. And it's also in this situation that you've had the emergence of armed militias, particularly in the northern West Bank, to more actively resist not only the settlers, but also the Israeli military, which in the larger scheme of things forms a much bigger problem for Palestinian rights than do the settlers.
We've seen over this last weekend the violence increase over the scenario of a settler teenager being found dead, and Netanyahu describing it as a heinous crime, and yet unable to talk about any of the other crimes committed against the Palestinians. I suppose that's something that we expect. But again, to the viewer, it just seems that when you are occupied, that you should take some responsibility for being the occupier.
Well, that's certainly the case under international law. Israel, of course, views itself as the victim of those that it occupies rather than the aggressor against them. And again, the fundamental problem here is that Israel has an agenda of territorial expansion leading ultimately to the formal annexation of these territories. Israel's Western allies have chosen a policy of effectively active support or passive acquiescence. Their opposition to these Israeli policies never extends beyond verbal admonitions. And as long as that changes, the UN can point to Israel's responsibilities to rein in settler violence as much as it wants, but within the framework of what every human rights organization that has looked at this has determined is a situation of apartheid, nothing will change.
Sometimes with such a complicated story, it's always good to get back to basics to help our audience understand what's going on. So Mouin Rabbani, thanks so much for unpicking the situation for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.